In 2013, deep within Yellowstone National Park, a group of hunters shot and killed an aggressive grizzly bear. The animal had been acting erratically, even threatening nearby tourists. Park authorities deemed it a danger and gave the green light to put it down. What followed was routine, a post-mortem examination of the bear's body to determine its health, recent diet, and behavior. But what they found inside its stomach stunned everyone. Amid the partially digested remains of the bear's last meals was a steel badge. Not just any badge, a ranger's badge. Weathered, yes, but unmistakably intact. The name engraved on it sent a wave of confusion and dread through everyone in the room. Michael Davis. The badge was still legible. Alongside it was a metal shirt button, the kind once used on park ranger uniforms in the 1980s. The implications were terrifying. Michael Davis had disappeared without a trace in the summer of 1987, 26 years earlier. Official records had long declared him presumed dead, likely the victim of a bear attack. No body had ever been found, no final evidence uncovered. Until now, the story broke quickly, making headlines in the region. It wasn't just a curiosity. It was a cold case coming back to life. The public wanted answers. The Park Service reopened the Michael Davis case with fresh urgency, and a team of investigators began to re-examine everything. Back in 1987, Davis had been dispatched to a remote part of the park where signs of strange animal behavior had been reported. Fallen trees, disturbed brush. No clear reason, but enough to warrant inspection. Davis went alone, reporting it over his radio before heading deeper into the wild. That was the last anyone heard from him. A massive search was launched. Rangers, volunteers, helicopters, and dogs combed the area for weeks. What they found painted a haunting picture. Scraps of fabric believed to be from his uniform, claw marks in the soil, and scattered debris. It looked like a predator had attacked, but there was no body, nothing conclusive. Eventually, the Park Service closed the case, citing a likely bear mauling as the cause of death. A tragic accident in one of America's most dangerous landscapes. But even then, some who knew Davis well had their doubts. He was experienced, cautious, not someone prone to mistakes. And now, 26 years later, the badge found inside the stomach of a bear born in 2008 raised disturbing new questions. How could something swallowed by a bear born more than 2 decades after Davis disappeared have belonged to him? Was it even possible for items like that to survive in the forest for so long, undamaged and unclaimed, only to wind up in a grizzly's gut? Veterinary experts weighed in. They ruled out the theory that the bear had consumed the remains of another animal that might have eaten Davis. The condition of the items was too pristine, and there were no other known incidents of anything similar in the region. No evidence of other bears swallowing metal items from decades past. No logical explanation. That left only one conclusion. Someone had placed those items inside the bear deliberately. But who? And why? The idea sounded absurd at first. Yet the evidence left little room for coincidence. Investigators tracked down the hunters who shot the bear. They confirmed the discovery, down to the exact moment they cut open the animal's stomach. There was no sign of tampering, no time or opportunity to plant the items after the fact. The badge and the button were real. They had belonged to Michael Davis. Now, the case was no longer just a disappearance. It was possibly a cover-up, possibly murder. And someone had gone to great lengths to create an illusion or to erase the truth. Investigators returned to the original 1987 file. Archived witness interviews, search maps, old radio logs, statements from co-workers. Among the aging documents, something stood out. A ranger's report noting unusual tracks near the area Davis was last seen. They were never identified. Too vague. At the time, they were dismissed as natural deformation, weather, or animal movement. But in hindsight, they might have been something else entirely. The working theory began to shift. What if Michael Davis hadn't been killed by a bear? What if he encountered something, or someone, else that day? The badge and button, carefully removed and preserved, may have been kept and then, for some unknown reason, planted 2 decades later. The theory pointed toward human hands. Not nature, And for the first time in 26 years, the death of Ranger Michael Davis wasn't just a tragic wilderness mystery. It was something far more disturbing. And it was only the beginning. The discovery of Michael Davis's badge inside the bear reopened a case everyone thought had been buried by time and the wild. But now, the 1987 disappearance was under a new kind of scrutiny, no longer viewed as a tragic accident, but potentially something else entirely. Investigators began their work by going backward. They pulled the original file from the archives, yellowed pages, old Polaroids, and typewritten statements from those who knew Davis best. One thing quickly became clear. The original search had been rushed. Pressured by public panic and limited by the tools of the time, the team in 1987 had pieced together a conclusion from incomplete clues. What they believed back then was this. Davis had responded to a call about strange bear activity in a remote section of Yellowstone, an area known for its steep ravines and geothermal pockets. He went alone. He radioed once to say he had arrived. Then silence. By nightfall, when he didn't return, concern turned to alarm. A full-scale search began. For weeks, rangers scoured the region. They found a torn shred of shirt caught on a tree branch, claw marks near stream, a torn boot print, but nothing definitive. No blood, no body. The official version, that Davis had been ambushed by a bear and his remains scattered or buried, had always carried a shadow of doubt, especially among fellow rangers. Davis was not reckless. He was trained, methodical, and known for always calling his location. That he would enter dangerous territory without backup didn't sit right with those who had worked beside him. Now, with this strange reappearance of his belongings, the team began re-interviewing everyone from 1987. Former colleagues, old friends, even family. The consensus remained. Davis had no enemies, no debt, no reason to vanish. But then, a retired ranger mentioned something, almost in passing. That changed everything. There had been tension, he said, between Davis and another ranger, a man named Silas Blackwood. Blackwood wasn't officially listed in the investigation files. He had resigned shortly after Davis disappeared, moved out of state. The old ranger couldn't remember the details, just that Blackwood was known for being combative, dismissive of rules, and often clashed with Davis over poaching enforcement. That was the first real lead. Investigators began digging into Blackwood's history. What they found was unsettling. Numerous citations for illegal hunting in the 1980s, multiple warnings for crossing into restricted zones, and 2 incident reports, both filed by Michael Davis. In one, Davis had confiscated several steel traps set illegally in a protected zone. Blackwood, according to the report, had been furious. He told Davis that the forest punishes snitches. At the time, it was written off as anger. Now it felt more like a threat. Still, there was nothing that tied Blackwood directly to Davis's disappearance. No proof he was in the area that day. No motive strong enough, yet to suggest murder. But then came the breakthrough. Investigators ordered a full inventory of evidence collected in 1987. Not the digital scans, but the physical boxes, untouched for decades. Dust-covered crates arrived from the archives. Old canvas bags, soil samples, tattered notebooks. And at the bottom of one box, something had been overlooked. A disposable Kodak camera. The kind popular with tourists in the 80s. It had been found in Davis's abandoned truck, tossed in the glove compartment. Its film was never developed. The original team assumed it was just filled with scenery photos. But modern forensic labs can do what the 80s couldn't. The camera was rushed to Quantico, where FBI analysts began the delicate process of extracting any images that had survived. Weeks passed. The team tried not to get their hopes up. After all, 26 years of heat and corrosion likely destroyed the film. But when the results arrived, it was nothing short of a miracle. Several photos were recovered. At first, they seemed ordinary, wide shots of Yellowstone, geysers, wildlife, rolling hills. But the last 3 images were different. Blurry, rushed, snapped in panic. One showed a makeshift lean-to, hastily built from branches. Trash littered the forest floor. In the second frame, clearer, The carcass of what looked like a moose lay on the ground. Surrounding it were men, faces turned away, knives in hand, frozen mid-motion. Poachers. It was clear now. Davis hadn't stumbled into a bear's territory. He'd stumbled into an illegal camp. The final image stopped everyone cold. A close-up, blurred by movement. A man's face contorted in rage, staring directly into the lens. Mid-attack, one arm raised, his expression unmistakable. Fury, fear, and recognition. Someone who had seen Davis. And now Davis had seen him. Digital enhancement sharpened the image. The eyes, the shape of the jaw, the thick beard. It wasn't perfect, but when it was shown to the old ranger again, he spoke without hesitation. That's Silas. Silas Blackwood. After 26 years of silence, they finally had a suspect. The photo matched Silas Blackwood's records. The history of conflict, the threats, the poaching charges. And now, visual evidence placing him at the scene moments before Davis disappeared. But one question remained. If Blackwood had killed Davis, how did the badge end up inside a bear 2 decades later? As they built their case, investigators began a nationwide manhunt. Blackwood had vanished from official records in the early 1990s. No taxes, no job, no phone, a ghost, until they found him, living in the mountains of Montana. Alone, off-grid, reclusive, but very much alive, and he had no idea what was coming. When the pieces finally began falling into place, everything pointed in one direction, to a man who had spent the last 2 decades trying to disappear. Silas Blackwood, once a known poacher and troublemaker in Yellowstone, now little more than a ghost haunting the paper trail of a long-forgotten murder. Detectives trace him to a weathered cabin deep in the Montana mountains. No phone, no neighbors, and barely a mark on the grid. He lived alone, hunted for food, and rarely came into town. The few who knew of his existence described him as reclusive, quiet, and always watching the tree lean. Detective Alan Miller, the man heading the new investigation, didn't hesitate. With 2 agents, he drove hours through back roads and dirt paths until they reached a crooked wooden cabin half swallowed by forest. It was exactly what he expected. Smoke curling from the chimney, tools stacked neatly on the porch, animal traps hanging like relics on the siding. This wasn't just a home, it was a bunker, a place where a man could forget the world, and hope the world forgot him too. They approached the door, knocked, footsteps shuffled inside, slow and deliberate. When it opened, there stood a man whose face matched the digitally enhanced photo recovered from Michael Davis's last camera. Older, thinner, but unmistakable. The eyes were hollow, sunken with years of solitude, but still sharp. Silas Blackwood? Miller asked. The man only nodded. They didn't need to explain who they were. He already knew. Without protest, he opened the door wider, let them in. The inside of the cabin was claustrophobic. Old wool blankets, a crack stove, the sour smell of wood smoke, and something metallic, oil maybe. On the walls hung faded maps of Yellowstone. Traps, knives, ropes. This was a man still living the shadow of a place he had once fled. They sat at the rough-hewn table. Miller placed a photograph between them. The enhanced image of Blackwood's face, frozen in rage, from the last photo taken by a dying ranger. Silas stared at it for a long time. His fingers twitched slightly, his breath slow. Then finally he spoke. I knew this day would come. His voice was hoarse, weathered, a man who had spoken more to himself than to people for decades. And then he began to confess, without prompting, without bargaining, not a word of denial. He told them about the summer of 1987, about the illegal hunt, about the moose they had shot and dragged into the forest to butcher away from prying eyes. He named his 2 accomplices, both long dead from alcohol and bad luck. Then he described the moment it all changed. Michael Davis stepped out of the trees like a ghost, silent, camera in hand. He took photos, didn't speak. He wasn't trying to confront them. Not yet. He was gathering evidence. Blackwood knew what it meant. He'd spent years skirting the law. But this was different. Federal charges. Felony poaching. One of his partners was already on parole. Prison was a guarantee. He tried to reason with Davis, offered him the meat, money, anything. But Davis stood his ground. He told them to lay down their weapons and wait for backup. Then came the struggle. One of Blackwood's friends panicked, lunged at Davis. A fight broke out in the clearing. The radio was smashed against a rock. Davis fought like a man with everything to lose. And then it happened. Blackwood grabbed a piece of broken log and brought it down on Davis's skull. The ranger collapsed instantly, silent, motionless. Everything went quiet. The forest, the birds, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. They stood over Davis's body in stunned silence, realizing what they had done. A federal ranger was dead, and now they were fugitives, not just poachers. What followed was methodical. Blackwood took Davis's wallet, his watch, and then specifically his badge and the button from his shirt. He said it was instinct, a hunter's instinct. Metal items could reflect sunlight, be discovered. Better to remove them. Then they wrapped the body in a tarp and dragged it through the forest for miles, to a ravine littered with fallen trees and geothermal vents, a place known for predators and shifting ground, a place where nothing stays still and nothing is ever found. They dumped the body into a deep crevice, weighted it with rocks, and covered it in debris. No one ever found it. The search came and went. The headlines faded, and the story that Davis had been killed by a bear became the accepted truth. But Blackwood never forgot. The guilt festered like a wound that wouldn't close. He left Wyoming, drank, moved, hid, until finally he landed here, in a cabin built not just from wood and nails, but from the pieces of a life he destroyed. He kept two things, the badge and the button, stored in an old tin tobacco box, hidden in a drawer. He didn't know why. A reminder? A trophy? Or some twisted version of penance? Years passed. His accomplices died. The story remained buried. But fear, he said, has a way of creeping back in, especially when you're old, when death feels close. When you begin to wonder, what happens if someone finds it all after you're gone? And so, in a final act of twisted genius, he decided to get rid of the evidence, not by fire, not by burying it, but by weaponizing the lie. He returned to Yellowstone, tracked a young solitary bear, and killed it. Then, in a grotesque reenactment of nature's cruelty, he cut open its belly, placed a badge and button inside, and stitched it shut. His logic was simple. One day, if the bear was ever killed and dissected, the discovery would throw investigators off track. A badge from the 80s inside a bear born in the 2000s? Impossible. Absurd. A mystery with no answer. It would reinforce the myth, the lie, that Davis had been taken by the wild. But he miscalculated. What he didn't expect was modern technology, digital restoration, and a detective who believed in dusty boxes over tidy explanations. And now, all his planning, all his paranoia, had led to pass straight to his doorstep. With Silas Blackwood's confession recorded in his face no longer hidden in a blurred photograph, the mystery that had haunted Yellowstone for 26 years began to unravel. But there was still one unanswered question, one that gnawed at the heart of the investigation. Where was Michael Davis? A confession was not a body. Blackwood had described the location of the disposal site in detail. A ravine somewhere deep within the restricted, predator-heavy zones of the park. It wasn't just coordinates he gave, but memories. Landmarks burned into his mind. A rock shaped like a wolf's head. A dried-up creek bed. 3 pines struck by lightning. These weren't just clues. They were the lingering shadows of guilt, imprinted into the forest by a man who could never forget. Detective Miller knew what they had to do. A full search team was assembled. Park rangers, forensic anthropologists, and law enforcement officers. The site was remote, wild, and untouched for decades. Accessing it meant navigating miles of overgrown trail, unstable slopes, and terrain ruled by nature, not man. It took days just to reach the ravine Blackwood had described. When they stood at the edge and looked down, it was clear why the body had never been found. The bottom was choked with decades of fallen branches, thick layers of pine needles, and soil disturbed by generations of scavengers. They descended carefully, not just with equipment, but with reverence. Everyone on that team knew the weight of what they were looking for. On the second day, the breakthrough came. One of the rangers, brushing away debris near the base of a mossy outcrop, hit something solid. Not a rock. Something shaped. Something made. He called the others. They knelt and began clearing the earth by hand. And there it was. A boot. Tattered. Faded. But unmistakable. Regulation issue from the 1980s, matching the uniform Davis had been wearing on the day he disappeared. Beside it, half buried, were several bone fragments, brittle, stained dark by years of decay. Vertebrae, a femur, a sliver of skull. The earth had not surrendered the body willingly, but it had surrendered enough. Forensic teams worked quickly, carefully bagging the remains and logging the GPS coordinates. DNA tests later confirmed what they already knew. The bones belonged to Michael Davis. For the first time in 26 years, Davis was no longer just a name on a file. He was real, found, proven, and now he could be buried. The news rippled across the nation. What had once been a forgotten story, a lost ranger swallowed by the wilderness, was now a full-blown true crime revelation. The media latched onto the story, the badge and the bear, the Yellowstone cover-up, the man who vanished into trees. But for Davis's family, the headlines didn't matter. They had spent over 2 decades trapped between grief and hope, told that their brother, uncle, and friend had likely been eaten by a bear. Now they knew the truth, that he died not by the claws of a predator, but by the hands of men, trying to protect the park he had sworn to serve. His sister, now elderly, released a quiet statement. Michael always believed in the law, even when it put him in danger. He didn't back down. Now we finally know why he never came home. A modest memorial was held in Davis's hometown. Former colleagues, friends, and family gathered to honor a man whose disappearance had once been considered a tragic mystery and was now recognized as a sacrifice in the line of duty. But while the family mourned and the public reacted, one final chapter was still unfolding. The trial. Blackwood had confessed, yes, but justice required process. He was transported under armed guard to Wyoming, booked on charges of first-degree murder of a federal employee. The evidence was overwhelming. His confession, the recovered remains, the photo and forensic analysis that confirmed Davis's items were deliberately planted inside the bear. There was no plea deal, no argument, no courtroom drama. Just one tired man, now 82, standing before a judge and admitting to everything. The court didn't hesitate. Life in prison, without parole. The sentence was symbolic. At his age, Blackwood wouldn't survive long. But the message was clear. Some truths don't fade with time. Some crimes echo louder the longer they remain buried. He was sent to a maximum security federal facility in Colorado. 2 years later, he died of a heart attack in his sleep. No funeral, no visitors, just a short obituary that made no mention of what he'd done. He carried the weight of the forest, the fear, and the badge and the bear with him into the ground. But the truth, at last, remained above it. The investigators who cracked the case knew how close it had come to staying unsolved forever, if not for a forgotten camera, a grainy photo, and the strange decision to hide evidence in the most grotesque way imaginable. A steel badge inside a bear. It was a story so bizarre, so implausible, that for years no one could explain it. Some called it fate. Some called it madness. But in the end, it was exactly what it looked like. A desperate man trying to twist the truth into something untraceable. And failing, the case was closed. The killer was dead. And the ranger's bones had finally been returned home. But Yellowstone didn't forget. Even after the media moved on and the court record were filed away, those who worked in the park, the rangers, trackers, and seasonal workers, spoke of the story in hushed voices, not because they feared it, but because they felt it, as if the forest itself had watched it all happen. And, in a way, it had. You see, Yellowstone is not just a national park. It is an ancient world where time folds on itself and secrets sink into the soil like blood into moss. Tourists see the geysers, the elk, the scenic trails. But the rangers, the ones who stay through every winter, every storm, every disappearing hiker, they know the park has moods and memories. After the body of Michael Davis was found, strange things started surfacing. Not ghosts, not shadows in the woods, just patterns. One of the search team members, a veteran ranger named Ellis, reported that on their final night at the ravine, he heard what he described as something pacing in the trees beyond their camp. When they shone their flashlights, nothing was there, but the tracks were bare human footprints. No boots, no shoes, no bear, just prints circling. Another ranger claimed that his GPS would reset every time he passed the old Wolfhead Rock. Not malfunction, reset, as if it refused to acknowledge their location. Of course, officially, no one filed a report. This was Yellowstone. Things happened, but the rumors took on their own life. They said the area where Davis was killed, the place Blackwood had picked, had been avoided by native tribes for centuries. Oral legend spoke of it as the hollow place, where man forgets his name. Elders warned against sleeping there, against bringing fire, against speaking aloud after nightfall. To Blackwood, it had seemed like the perfect place to bury a body, but maybe that was the point. Some places don't just hide the dead, they invite them. And now that the story had resurfaced, the ranger, the poachers, the bear, some felt the park had begun to remember. Back at the station, newly hired rangers were told the story like a cautionary tale, not about murder, but about disappearance. How a seasoned ranger walked into the forest and vanished. How his badge turned up inside a creature that shouldn't have existed in his timeline. How a cheap camera, forgotten in a glove box for 26 years, unraveled a lie stronger than myth. The lesson? The forest doesn't always kill you. Sometimes, it waits for you to kill yourself. And when you do, it holds on to the evidence, the torn jacket, the button, the last flash of camera, and spits it back out when the time is right. For Michael Davis's family, the mystery had finally ended. But for those who patrol the woods, the line between man and nature, between cause and consequence, had blurred. Years after the trial, a young ranger named Claire posted anonymously on a forum for wilderness workers. She described a routine patrol near the ravine where Davis's body had been found. The snow was heavy. Her radio was dead, but as she passed through a clearing, she found something hanging from a tree branch. A steel park ranger badge. Not rusted, not weather-worn. Clean, polished, like it had just been placed there. The name on the badge? Michael Davis. She took a picture, submitted it to her superior. But when they returned the next day, it was gone. No badge, no prints, not even broken snow. Just the forest, silent, still. Some say she imagined it. Others aren't so sure. Because the truth about Yellowstone is this. It doesn't forget. It doesn't forgive. And it always returns what was stolen. Eventually, Michael Davis was taken from the park, then hidden, then turned into a story, and finally reclaimed. Whether that was justice or just coincidence, no one can say. But there's a trail marker near the old ravine now. Quiet, unofficial, a small wooden sign, carved by hand, tied to a tree with ranger twine. It reads, Davis Point. He walked alone, but he wasn't forgotten. No dates, no explanation, just a reminder that some ghosts wear boots, and some forests never stop listening. If there was a moment when the truth clawed its way out of the past, it wasn't the confession, it wasn't the badge, it was the camera. A cheap, disposable Kodak, yellow plastic casing, the kind you'd buy in a gas station for $10, the kind that shouldn't survive 26 years locked inside a glove compartment, baking in summer heat, freezing in winter ice, and forgotten beneath paper maps and faded brochures. But it did, and inside that fragile plastic box, time had been trapped. Detective Miller didn't expect much when he sent it to Quantico. By then, he had hit wall after wall. Interviews led nowhere. Leads grew cold. The case was falling back into the shadows, exactly where it had spent the last 2 decades. But something told him, check the camera. Not a hunch, not instinct, just frustration, and maybe a little hope. Weeks passed. Then an email arrived. Subject line, recovered images, case hashtag YD1987. The FBI had done the impossible. Using advanced digital recovery techniques, They had extracted the images from the degraded film. It wasn't perfect. The colors were warped. The edges bled. But the pictures were there. Each one a flicker of light from a time long gone. The first few were mundane. Postcard shots of Yellowstone. A geyser mid-eruption. A herd of bison in the distance. A trail winding between pine trees. But then came the last three. Blurred. Rushed. Uneven exposures. Not the kind of shot someone takes for a scrapbook. The kind of shot someone takes when they know they don't have time. The first showed a clearing deep in the woods. Piles of trash. A makeshift shelter. Nothing natural. Nothing legal. The second showed an animal carcass, probably a moose, half butchered. Around it stood 3 men, faces blurred, hands holding knives, clothing stained. These weren't hunters. These were poachers. The kind Davis had written about in his final reports. The third photo was different. It was close, shaky, snapped in the middle of motion. A man lunging forward, his face distorted in fury, his eyes burning, his mouth caught in a mid-roar, and in the corner, barely visible, was Michael Davis's hand, holding the camera. Mid-click, that frame changed everything. It wasn't just a photo. It was the moment before impact, the freeze frame of a murder in progress. Miller printed the image and took it to the old Ranger files. He started asking questions, showing it around. Most said they couldn't tell who it was. Too blurry, too old. But one man, a retired park officer, leaned in, squinted, and said just 2 words. That's Blackwood. Silas Blackwood. The tracker. The poacher. The man who hated rangers. The man Davis had once written up for setting illegal snares. The man who vanished after the 1990s and never came back. The photo wasn't a memory. It was a witness. When Miller finally confronted Blackwood in his Montana cabin, he didn't need to speak. He just laid the photograph on the table between them and watched the color drain from the old man's face. That was when the story spilled out. 26 years of guilt, the poaching trip, the confrontation, the panic, and the blow that ended Michael Davis's life. It wasn't a confession born of pressure. It was relief. The kind of release only someone who's been haunted every night can feel. The kind of guilt that sleeps beside you like a second skin. But here's the part that's hard to explain. Why was the camera still there? Why hadn't it been logged, processed, noticed? It had been mentioned in the original reports, yes, but dismissed, never developed, never tested. Like some part of the truth didn't want to come out yet. Or maybe the truth was waiting for the world to be ready. Waiting for someone stubborn enough to open a dusty old evidence box. Waiting for a murder to finally matter. Because that camera, that ugly little Kodak, had become more than evidence. It was a message from the past, from the ranger who knew he might not make it back. Click. One last photo. One last chance to tell the world who did it. And the photo did, even decades later, even after the body was gone, even after the killer had tried to bury the evidence in the belly of a bear. That camera refused to die, and neither did the truth. So the next time you find an old photo, a worn badge, a forgotten object left where it shouldn't be, ask yourself, what story is it still trying to tell? And who is still listening? Yellowstone had kept its secrets for 26 years. But the forest, it turns out, remembers everything. After Blackwood's confession and the discovery of Michael Davis's remains, the public considered the case solved. Newspapers called it the final chapter. Local news ran tidy headlines. Cold case closed after 26 years. But the people who work in Yellowstone, the ones who walk the same trails Davis once patrolled, who hear the branches snap in the dark and know the difference between wind and warning, they knew it wasn't over, because the ground still whispered, and the forest hadn't finished speaking. After the body was recovered, a team of rangers returned to the ravine Blackwood had described. Not as part of the investigation, that was done, but out of something else. A pull, a need to understand, to see it with their own eyes. What they found wasn't just a dump site. It was a place that felt heavy. Trees that didn't grow quite right. Bent trunks. Stunted branches. No animal tracks. No bird song. Just silence, thick and suffocating. One ranger, Claire, later said, it was like the forest was still holding its breath. They marked the location on the official map, gave it a name, Davis Hollow, but most refused to go back. The forest had returned the bones, but not the peace. And then came the odd reports. A veteran hiker claimed she saw an old ranger uniform hanging from a tree near Davis Hollow, perfectly intact, despite the years. When she doubled back an hour later, it was gone. Another story came from a seasonal volunteer who swore he saw someone standing near the tree line during his sunrise patrol, a tall man in green, broad shoulders, watching silently. When he called out, the figure turned and vanished without a sound. But the strangest report came from a group of tourists. They were hiking along a lesser-known trail, near a geyser that had gone dormant decades ago. They got lost, disoriented by faulty GPS. As the sun set, they stumbled across a small, hand-carved sign nailed to a tree. It said, "Turn back. This trail isn't safe after dark." No park signage ever used that language, and none of the rangers admitted to placing it. They turned back. When they described the location to officials, it was just a few hundred feet from the ravine where Davis had been found. Now, here's the part that makes even seasoned rangers uncomfortable. When they returned to the spot the next day to remove the unauthorized sign, it wasn't there. No nails, no wood, no tree carving, just pine needles and silence. Something about this story stays with people. Maybe it's because it forces us to admit that not all mysteries are lost in the past. Some are buried right beneath our feet. Or maybe it's because the case didn't end with an arrest. It ended with a warning. A reminder that justice doesn't always bring closure. That solving a crime doesn't erase the scar it leaves behind. And the forest doesn't forget the blood that soaks into its roots. It doesn't forget the way a man screamed when he fell. It doesn't forget the lie that was told, and the camera that outlived its owner. Some believe Michael Davis never left Yellowstone, that his story now belongs to the woods. And the woods are still telling it. Late at night, when the wind whips through the trees like a howl, when the park grows quiet and the radio static starts to hum, some rangers swear they hear it. A whisper, just a name. Davis. They say the dead don't speak. But sometimes it's the silence that screams the loudest. Michael Davis was finally laid to rest in the fall of 2013. His family, what was left of it, gathered in a small cemetery far from Yellowstone. The weather was cold. Wind brushed dry leaves across the headstones like fingers dragging secrets. His sister placed a hand on the casket and whispered something no one else could hear. For 26 years, they had lived with doubt, with questions. Was it a bear? Was it something worse? Was he alive? Was he suffering? Now they had answers. Not the ones they wanted, but real ones. Michael Davis died doing his job. He died trying to uphold the law, trying to document a crime with nothing but a radio and a $10 camera. He didn't run. He didn't scream. He stood his ground, and he paid the price for it. The court proceedings were brief. Silas Blackwood never denied a word. He confessed to everything. The poaching, the cover-up, the killing blow, and the final grotesque act, slicing open a living creature just to stuff it with lies. A desperate plan to bury the truth by creating a mystery so absurd no one would think to look for the answer. He thought he'd be gone before it unraveled, but the past caught up. In the end, Blackwood was sentenced to life in prison. He died 2 years later, heart failure in a concrete cell. No obituary, no visitors, just a note in a file that said, "Deceased, unclaimed remains." And so, the circle closed. A ranger vanishes. A badge is found. A lie is told. And the truth claws its way back from the grave. But what does it all mean? Why did this case resonate so deeply with the public? Why did it become a campfire legend, a podcast obsession, a file that no one could let go? Maybe it's because of how close it danced to the edge of the impossible. A badge inside a bear. A camera that wouldn't die. A ghost that never stopped walking the forest. It had all the makings of folklore, until it was proven real. And maybe that's the most disturbing part of all. This wasn't a story. This was truth. The kind of truth that lives in the dirt, that rots in glove compartments and waits inside old film rolls. The kind of truth that refuses to stay buried. It reminds us that people disappear every day. Not always in a flash of violence. Sometimes in silence. Sometimes because someone thinks they're clever enough to erase them. But the earth keeps score. So does time. And sometimes, against all odds, the truth wins. Michael Davis never made it home from his final shift. But in the end, he got what so many others never do. His story was told. And his name? It's not just etched on a gravestone now. It's remembered by those who walk the forest trails. By those who carry cameras not just to capture beauty, but to defend justice. And by those who believe that even in the darkest places, even after decades, the truth still matters.